The women of Grover's Bluff had a saying about Hezekiah Hawthorne's ranch. They said the mountain let you in easy enough. It was the man inside that sent you back down. Nobody counted the exact number of women who had come and gone from that high country property over the years, but the postmaster, Gerald Finch, claimed he had forwarded at least 9 return letters on behalf of 9 different women, all of them addressed back east, all of them written within the first week of arrival. He mentioned this without cruelty, just the way a man mentions weather. Matter of fact. Inevitable. Viola Candace Moore did not know about Gerald Finch or his letters when she stepped off the stage in Grover's Bluff on a gray Tuesday morning in October, but she knew only what the correspondents had told her, that a man named Hezekiah Hawthorne owned 400 acres above the tree line, ran cattle, kept to himself, and was in need of a wife. The letter had been brief, almost insultingly brief. No flourishes, no promises, no flattery. Just the facts of the land and the arrangement, signed at the bottom in tight, even handwriting. She had read that letter 4 times on the journey west, not because it confused her, because something in its bluntness had felt more honest than anything she'd received in years. The man waiting at the edge of the road near the stage stop was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, lean through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rock as the mountains behind him, but he wore no expression that she could identify as welcoming or unwelcoming. He simply stood there with his hat in one hand and looked at her the way a man looks at a fence line he's calculating the cost of repairing. "Miss Moore," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. He picked up her trunk without asking and carried it to the wagon. He did not offer his hand to help her up. She didn't wait for it. They rode the better part of 2 hours without exchanging more than a dozen words. The trail climbed steadily, the pine trees thickening on either side until the town below disappeared entirely. Viola watched the land and said nothing. She had learned some time ago that silence was not the same as emptiness, and that a person who rushed to fill it usually did so for their own comfort, not anyone else's. Hez kept his eyes on the horses. The ranch, when it finally appeared around a long bend in the trail, was not what the letter had described as much as what it had implied. The house was solid, well built, well kept, but stripped of anything decorative. No curtains in the windows she could see from outside, no flower box, no wreath on the door. It was a working house. Every inch of it said so. There was a barn twice the size of the main structure, a smokehouse, a water pump that looked recently repaired, a woodpile stacked with the kind of precision that most men reserved for bookkeeping. She stood in the yard for a moment and took it all in. "I'll show you the inside," Hez said from behind her. The inside was the same as the outside, functional, clean in a sparse way. A table with 2 chairs, an iron stove that had been black polished recently, and a shelf of supplies organized by size. A single framed piece on the wall that turned out to be not a painting, but a hand-drawn map of the property lines. There were no personal effects that she could see, no photographs, no letters, no small objects that accumulate in a home the way sediment accumulates in a riverbed, the quiet evidence of a life being lived. It looked, Viola thought, less like a home than like a place someone was waiting in. "Your room is there," he said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "Meals are at 5:30 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. I work from first light. I don't expect conversation during work hours. Sunday is rest, but the animals still need tending. There's a list of the household duties on the table." He said all of this the way another man might read from a ledger. Viola looked at the list he had mentioned. It was thorough, written in the same tight, even hand as the letter. She picked it up and read it fully without comment, then set it back down. "Any questions?" he asked. "Just one," she said, looking up at him. "Do you eat what you cook yourself, or have you been starving quietly up here?" Something shifted in his face. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't nothing either. "I manage," he said, and walked back outside. She stood in that kitchen for a moment after he left, and looked around again, at the bare walls, the 2 chairs, the window that faced the mountain without any softening frame around it. Then she set her traveling bag on the table, opened it, and began to unpack. The first woman, she had heard from the stagecoach driver without asking, had left after 3 days, said the man never spoke. The second had lasted 5 days, said he corrected the way she swept the porch. The driver had laughed telling it, as though it were a long-running joke the whole county shared. Viola had not laughed. She thought about that. As she moved around the kitchen, learning where everything was kept, running her fingers along the edge of the stove, opening the small window above the basin to let in the cold pine air. She was not here because she had no options. She was here because she had made a choice, and she was not in the habit of walking away from choices because they turned out to be harder than expected. Dinner that evening was quiet. She cooked. He came in at exactly 6, washed his hands at the basin, sat down, and ate without complaint. She had made a simple salt pork stew with the stores she found in the pantry. It wasn't remarkable, but he finished every bite and pushed the bowl back with something that might have been, if you were watching closely, a fraction of relief. She noticed. She also noticed, when she glanced toward the window during the meal, that he watched her reflection in the glass for just a moment before looking back down at his bowl. She said nothing about it. She simply cleared the dishes and began washing them in the basin. He stood to leave, then stopped near the door. "You didn't ask about the others," he said. His back was still to her. Viola set a bowl on the drying cloth and picked up the next one. "No," she said. "I didn't." A long pause. "Most women ask by the second hour," he said. "I'm not most women," she said simply. Not sharply, just as a fact. He was quiet for another moment. Then he went outside, and she heard his boots cross the porch, and then the barn door, and then nothing but the wind coming down off the mountain. Viola finished the dishes. She dried her hands, walked to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight for a while. Not anxious, not discouraged, just thinking. There was something underneath all that rigid silence. She had seen it in the way he organized his supply shelf, in the hand-drawn map on the wall, in the way he had finished every bite of a plain stew without a word of complaint or thanks, as though gratitude was a language he had once spoken, and then, somewhere along the way, decided was too costly to use. She didn't know yet what had made Hezekiah Hawthorne into a man who lived like a closed room, but she had a feeling she was going to find out. She blew out the lamp. Outside, the mountain was dark and enormous and utterly indifferent. And somewhere in the barn, she could hear the faint sound of movement, steady, deliberate, rhythmic. The sound of a man who didn't know how to stop working even when the day was done. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. She was not going anywhere. The second morning, Viola woke before the 5:30 bell. She didn't know what woke her, whether it was the cold coming through the window seam or some internal instinct that had quietly recalibrated to this new altitude overnight. She lay still for a moment and listened. The ranch was already making its sounds, boots on frozen ground, the low protest of cattle somewhere below the tree line, the rhythmic pull of the water pump. Yet he had been up for a while. She dressed without hurrying, built the stove fire from the coals he had left banked the night before. She noticed he had done that, left them banked, so the morning start would be easier, and began breakfast before the light had fully reached the kitchen window. He came in at 5:30 exactly, washed his hands, sat down. She set a plate in front of him. Cornbread, fried eggs, black coffee. He looked at it for half a second longer than he had looked at the stew the night before. Then he picked up his fork. "You were up early," he said. "So were you," she said. He didn't answer. But he didn't leave the table as quickly as he had the night before, either. That was the thing about Hezekiah Hawthorne that Viola had already begun to understand. He communicated almost entirely in what he did not do. The pauses were sentences. The small hesitations were paragraphs. A man like that required a different kind of listening, the kind most people never bothered to develop because it asked too much of them. Viola had learned that kind of listening a long time ago, in a different life, for different reasons. It wasn't something she spoke about easily. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him, not beside him, not at the far end, but directly across, where she could see his face in the gray morning light. He noticed. His jaw tightened very slightly, the way it did when something caught him off guard, and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He chose not to. After breakfast, he was gone. She heard him in the barn, then out toward the upper pasture, his voice carrying faintly on the cold air as he moved the cattle, but not harsh, just direct. He spoke to his animals the way he spoke to everything, economically, as though words were a finite resource, and he had learned early not to squander them. She spent the morning learning the house properly, not cleaning, it was already clean, but understanding it, where the drafts came in, which floorboard near the door had begun to soften and would need attention before winter deepened, how the stove drew when the wind came from the north versus the west. She found a crack along the base of the window in the main room that had been stuffed with cloth rather than properly sealed, a temporary fix that had become permanent through neglect, the way temporary things often do. She found a tin of putty in the supply room and fixed it herself. It was just past noon when she heard him come back. Yet he stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the window, then at her, then at the window again. "That's been like that for 2 winters, he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." He stood there a moment longer, and she had the distinct impression he was trying to decide whether to say something else. He turned and went back outside instead. She set the tin of putty back in the supply room and returned to the kitchen to start lunch. By the 3rd day, a shape had begun to form between them. Not warmth exactly. It was too early and too guarded for warmth, but something structural, a set of unspoken agreements. She cooked. He worked. She kept the house. He kept the land. At meals, they sat across from each other, and the silence was less like a wall and more like a room they were both standing in, just neither quite sure yet how to furnish it. He corrected her once, about the way she latched the supply room door, which had a particular trick to it that prevented it from swinging open in high wind. He showed her the motion without comment, his hand briefly covering the latch, and stepped back. She tried it, got it on the 2nd attempt. He nodded once and moved on. It was the most physical proximity they had shared, and it had lasted perhaps 4 seconds. She thought about that more than she intended to. On the 4th evening, something shifted. She had been outside near dusk, bringing in the last of the firewood from the stack, when she heard it. A sound from the far side of the barn that didn't belong to cattle, or wind, or the settling of timber. She set down the wood and walked around the corner. Hez was crouched beside a young calf that had separated from the others. The animal was trembling, legs tucked, eyes showing white at the edges. Something had spooked it badly. He had one hand pressed flat to its side and was speaking to it in a low, continuous murmur, his voice entirely different from the one he used with people. Patient, gentle, almost tender. He didn't hear her approach. She stood at the corner of the barn and watched for a moment. This rigid, rule-bound, wordless man speaking softly to a frightened animal in the last of the evening light, and felt something tighten in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She stepped back quietly and picked up the firewood and went inside. At dinner, she didn't mention it. He sat across from her, as composed and closed as always, and she looked at him and saw something she hadn't quite seen before. Not the coldness on the surface, but the shape of what was underneath it. "Did the calf settle?" she asked, keeping her voice even. His fork stopped. "You saw that," he said. It wasn't a question. "I came around the barn for the last of the wood," she said simply. A long pause. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was measuring something. "She's fine," he said. "She'll be fine by morning." Viola nodded and looked back at her plate. She didn't press. She had no interest in pressing. She had simply wanted him to know that she had seen it, that gentleness under there, quiet as groundwater, and that it had not surprised her the way he might have expected it to. That night she heard him stay in the barn longer than usual. The fifth day brought weather, and a hard gray sky that rolled in off the peaks before breakfast and settled over the ranch like a held breath. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped sharply, and the first snow came. Not gently, but sideways, in the particular aggressive way mountain snow arrives when it has made up its mind. Hez came in earlier than usual, stomped the snow from his boots at the door, hung his coat, and stood by the stove with his hands out toward the heat. His face was raw from the wind. Viola handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. He took it. Their fingers did not touch, but it was close. He looked at the cup, then at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Something unguarded, just for a fraction of a second, before the familiar composure reassembled itself. "Storm will hold through tomorrow," he said. "Oh, then we stay in," she said. He looked at her as if he wasn't sure what to do with that, with the ease of it, with the absence of complaint or fear. Every other woman, she suspected, had treated the isolation as evidence of something wrong. Viola treated it like weather, something you worked with, not against. They spent the afternoon inside. He sat at the table with his ledgers. She mended a tear in the curtain lining she had found in a chest. There had been curtains once, apparently, folded away and forgotten, and began hemming them to fit the main room window. He looked up from his ledgers once and saw what she was doing. She met his eyes without explanation. He looked back down. By evening, the curtains were hung. They changed the room in a way that was hard to define. Not dramatic, just slightly less hollow. And the lamplight caught in them and made the room feel, for the first time, like a place where someone intended to stay. Hez stood in the doorway of the main room before supper and looked at them for a long moment. He said nothing, but he didn't look away for a long time either. It was that night after supper when he spoke more words in a single sitting than he had in the entire 5 days combined. He was at the table with his coffee, and she was across from him with hers, the lamp between them, the snow pressing quietly against the new curtains, when he said, without preamble, without looking up, "My father built this house." Viola was still. "He built it for my mother," Hez continued, his voice low and unhurried. She lasted 3 winters. Then she went back to her people in Tennessee. Said the mountain was too quiet. Said she couldn't hear herself think up here. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. I was 7, he said. Viola said nothing. She understood in that moment the precise architecture of what she was looking at. The bare walls, the folded curtains, the 2-chair table. The man who had turned silence from a wound into a way of life, because silence was all the mountain had offered him after his mother left, and all his father had modeled in the years that followed. She understood it, and she did not rush to fix it with words. After a while, she said quietly, "How old was he when she left? Your father?" Hez looked up. It was clear no one had ever asked that before. 31, he said. Did he ever say much about it? No, Hez said. He just worked. She nodded slowly. Sounds familiar, she said, but something moved across his face. Recognition, she thought. The particular discomfort of being seen clearly by someone who isn't trying to wound you. He stood up, took his cup to the basin, and paused with his back to her. You haven't asked me why the others left, he said. No, she said. You're not curious? She considered that honestly. I think I already know, she said. And I don't think it's the reason you believe it is. He stood very still for a moment. Then, without another word, he went to his room. But he left his lamp burning longer than usual that night, and through the thin wall, she could hear him awake. Not moving, not working, just awake. In the way a man is awake when something he had set down a long time ago has just been quietly handed back to him, and he isn't sure yet whether he is ready to carry it. The storm broke on the 6th morning. Viola knew it before she opened her eyes. The quality of the silence had changed overnight, gone from that dense, pressurized quiet of heavy snowfall to something cleaner and stiller. The kind of silence that follows weather, the way a held breath follows a long exhale. She dressed and came into the kitchen and found the stove already lit. He had beaten her to it. There was coffee on. Not just coals banked. Actual coffee. Already brewed. Sitting in the pot with a cloth folded over the handle to keep it warm. She stood and looked at it for a moment, then poured herself a cup and looked out the window at the white-covered ranch, the peaks above it catching the first pale light, like something just beginning to wake up. She didn't remark on the coffee. She understood by now that remarking on things made him retreat, so she simply drank it and let it mean what it meant. He came in from the barn an hour later, snow on his shoulders, and she had breakfast waiting. He sat down. They ate. The silence between them that morning had a texture neither of them commented on, softer than before, somehow, less defended. Fence line on the north pasture took damage, he said midway through the meal. I'll need most of the day on it. I'll bring lunch out, she said. He looked up. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, and returned to her breakfast. He left without arguing. She noticed he didn't tell her which part of the north pasture either, as though he expected her to find him, or perhaps as though he hadn't quite decided yet whether he wanted her to. She found him anyway. It wasn't difficult. She followed the fence line east from the barn until she heard the steady rhythm of a hammer against a post. And then she saw him, coat dark against the white ground, working with that same concentrated precision he brought to everything, each movement deliberate and without waste. She came up beside him and set the lunch pail on a flat rock nearby. He drove 2 more nails before he stopped and turned. He looked at the pail, then at her, then at the distance she had covered through the snow to get there. "It's a long walk," he said. "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. He sat on the rock beside the pail and opened it. She stood a few feet away and looked out across the north pasture, the white ground broken only by the dark fence posts and the tree line beyond. The sky above it all so blue it almost hurt to look at. "It's beautiful up here," she said, not to fill silence, just because it was true. He chewed slowly and looked out at the same view. "Most women say it's lonely," he said. "Most women aren't wrong," she said. "It's both." He glanced at her sideways. Something in the line of his shoulders shifted, not dramatically, just the way a door shifts when a latch is released. Not yet open, but no longer held shut by force. They stayed like that for a while. The cold was sharp, but not cruel. The mountain was enormous around them, and entirely indifferent. And somehow that indifference made the small, warm fact of two people sitting near each other feel more significant than it might have elsewhere. He finished eating and closed the pail and handed it back to her. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he had said those words since she arrived. She accepted the pail and turned to go, and he went back to his fence posts, and neither of them said anything else. But she was smiling by the time she rounded the tree line, and she didn't bother trying to stop it. The days that followed were not dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no sudden transformations, no morning when Hezekiah Hawthorne woke up a different man. That was not how it worked with a man like him. She had understood that from nearly the beginning. What happened instead was smaller and slower, and, in her estimation, is considerably more real. He began leaving the stove already lit every morning. He stopped disappearing to the barn immediately after supper, staying instead at the table a few minutes longer each evening, not talking much, but present in a way he hadn't been that first week. Once, when she mentioned that the supply room shelf nearest the door had developed a lean, he fixed it the same afternoon without being asked again. She caught him one evening, standing in the doorway of the main room and looking at the curtains she had hung. Just looking. The lamplight moved in them gently, and the room had the quality of a place that was, slowly and cautiously, becoming a home again. She said nothing. She let him look. Then, one afternoon in the third week, the postmaster's wagon came up the trail. Gerald Finch himself, red-faced from the cold, checked with a small parcel of mail and the undisguised curiosity of a man who had forwarded 9 return letters and was quietly astonished to find no 10th one in his bag. He stayed for coffee. She poured it, and he sat at the table and talked more than both of them combined, which was not difficult. And somewhere in the middle of his talking he said, with the frankness of a man who has simply stopped pretending people don't talk, "I'll be honest, Miss Moore. The whole town had bets on you by Thursday." Viola raised an eyebrow. "What kind of bets?" "On when you'd be coming back down," he said, with the grace to look slightly abashed. She set her cup down. "And what do they say now?" Gerald glanced at Hez, who was sitting with his coffee and looking at the table with the particular expression of a man who would very much like to be elsewhere. Then Gerald looked back at Viola, and a slow grin crossed his weathered face. "Now," he said, "they don't quite know what to say." After he left, the yard fell quiet again. Hez stood on the porch and watched the wagon descend the trail, and she stood beside him, not quite touching, both of them looking out at the valley below, where the town sat small and distant under the winter sky. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "That they talk?" "People talk about what they don't understand," she said. "It means nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "It used to bother me," he said slowly, as though he were examining the words as he produced them. After the second woman left, the whole county had an opinion about why. After the third, they stopped bothering to hide the opinions. He paused. I stopped going into town much after that. Viola looked at his profile, the hard jaw, the careful eyes, the way he held himself like a man permanently braced for impact. What do you think it was? She asked quietly. Why they left. He was still for a long time. I think, he said finally, I forgot how to make room for another person. My father never learned it after my mother left. I watched him close down, inch by inch, year by year, until there was nothing left but the work. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I told myself I wouldn't be like that. And then I was exactly like that. And by the time I noticed, I couldn't find the way back. It was the most she had ever heard him say. She didn't fill the moment with reassurance, didn't rush to tell him it was fine, or that he was wrong about himself, and she simply stood beside him and let the words exist in the cold air between them, solid and honest and long overdue. You noticed, she said at last. That's not nothing. He turned and looked at her directly, really looked at her, in a way that was different from all the guarded sideways glances of the past weeks, as though he had finally decided the looking was worth the risk. Why did you stay? He asked. The real reason. She held his gaze. Because I've met men who were unkind and called it strength, she said. You're not unkind. You're just unfinished. She paused. And I've never seen the sense in walking away from something unfinished. Something broke open in his expression then, not dramatically, not with the spectacle of a man falling apart, but quietly. The way ice at the edge of a river gives way in early spring, and not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, because the season has simply made holding together no longer necessary. He looked away after a moment, cleared his throat. I fixed the floorboard by the door, he said roughly. The soft one. She blinked. Then, very slowly, she smiled. I noticed, she said. They were married in the Grover's Bluff church on a Saturday in late February, 6 weeks after Viola Moore had stepped off the stage into the cold October morning. It was a small ceremony. The Reverend Gerald Finch and 3 ranching families who came partly out of warmth and partly out of the irresistible pull of witnessing something the town had quietly decided was impossible. Hez stood at the front of the church in a clean dark coat and looked at her walking up the aisle with the expression of a man trying very hard to maintain his composure and not quite managing it. His jaw was set. His hands were still. But his eyes were entirely undone. She reached him, and he looked at her for a moment before the Reverend began, and quietly, so that only she could hear, he said, You could have left. I know, she said simply. He nodded once, as though that settled something that had been unsettled in him for a very long time. The Reverend spoke. They answered when required. Hez's voice, when he made his promises, was low and even, and without the slightest hesitation. The voice of a man who had waited a long time to mean something completely, and was not going to waste the occasion. And when it was done, and they stepped out into the February cold, Gerald Finch shook Hez's hand with considerable enthusiasm, and told Viola she was the most sensible woman he had ever encountered, which she accepted graciously. On the ride back up the mountain, they sat close on the wagon bench, closer than necessary, closer than the cold alone required, and the valley fell away beneath them, and the ranch appeared around the long bend in the trail, solid and waiting, and changed somehow, the way a place changes when it has finally been decided upon. He helped her down from the wagon, and held her hand a moment longer than the task required. She looked up at him in the last of the afternoon light. "I'm going to plant something by the front porch in the spring," she said. Something that comes back every year." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a large thing, just a small and private and utterly genuine shift that she recognized by now as the closest he came to joy expressed without restraint. "All right," he said. She squeezed his hand once and went inside. He stood on the porch for a moment in the cold, looking out at the mountain, at the land his father had built and closed himself away in, at the fence lines he had mended alone for so many winters. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, Hezekiah Hawthorne did not feel like a man waiting for something. He felt like a man who had finally, quietly, come home. He went inside and closed the door behind him. The mountain stood as it always had, enormous, indifferent, and beautiful. But the light in the window was warm. And this time, it stayed on. By the following winter, there were curtains on every window and a child's laughter in the house that Hezekiah Hawthorne had built his walls inside of for so many years. Viola had planted climbing roses by the front porch as promised, and though they slept now beneath the snow, she had assured him they would come back in April. He believed her. He had learned by then to believe her about most things. Now, before we close, this story found its way to you somewhere in this wide world, and I'd genuinely love to know where. Whether you're watching from a quiet town, a busy city, a cold winter morning, or a warm evening somewhere far from any mountain, drop it in the comments. Tell me where in the world Hez and Viola's story reached you. And if there's something you felt this story could have done better, a moment that needed more space, a detail you wished had been explored, anything at all. Your thoughts are genuinely welcome. Every suggestion helps shape the next story, and I read more of them than you might think.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, Father sent his no-mail order bride could last a week with the mountain cowboy until she refused to leave. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how quiet understanding slowly changed both of them. Hezekiah wasn't a man of big words, and Viola didn't try to force him to become someone else overnight. She just stayed patient, paid attention, and made room for trust to grow naturally. Sometimes people aren't cold-hearted. They've just spent too long carrying life alone. I also think the story reminds us how much kindness can matter in everyday moments. A warm meal, listening without judging, fixing something small around the house. Those little things can slowly change a person more than grand gestures ever do. Have you ever met someone who seemed distant at first, but turned out to have a good heart underneath? And do you think Viola would have stayed if Hezekiah hadn't slowly opened up to her? If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment, like, or subscribe. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts and seeing how these stories connect with people from different walks of life.